Hello, everybody. Hope you are all doing well. I'm here with Chapter 2 of Book 2 of the Royal Rangers series, The Red Fox Clan. Let's go ahead and get into it. The analysis of Maddie's performance was held in one of the large central command tents. The three senior assessors sat behind a trestle table in comfortable canvas folding chairs, studying reports from the assessors who had examined her skills and abilities over the course of the gathering. Maddie stood before them, with her captor a half-pace behind her. The assessors glanced up as Will and Gillen entered the tent, lifting the canvas flaps to the side. Harlan, the most senior, nodded permission for them to come in. Will was Maddie's mentor, of course, so he had every right to be here and listen as they passed judgment on her performance. And Gillen, as commandant of the Ranger Corps, was entitled to go anywhere he pleased. In the time it had taken for the two to reach the tent, the panel had listened to the report from Maddie's captor. Now, Harlan spoke. "Unfortunately, we can't give you a pass on your unseen movement exercise," he said. His voice was not unkind. He was impressed with the overall level of Maddie's performance, as accounted in the written reports of those who had tested her. He glanced down at the reports fanned out in front of him. Shooting, excellent, he read, and he noted an addendum to the report. Unlike the other apprentices, Maddie had been assessed for her skill with the sling as well as the bow, and he raised his eyebrows as he saw that her scores over half a dozen tests averaged 95%. She was even better with the sling than with the bow, where she had scored an impressive 92%. Knife throwing, excellent. Unarmed combat, very good. Map making, another excellent result. Navigation skills, above average. And since average in the Ranger Corps meant excellent, that was saying something. Tactical planning, excellent. He leafed through the papers, seeing more excellent and above average ratings. He was impressed, and he knew his colleagues were as well. Third-year assessments were tough. It was the time when the examiners really began to bear down on the apprentices. They were more than halfway through their training, and they were expected to keep a high standard. He glanced up and caught Will Treaty's eye as the gray-bearded ranger stood just inside the entrance to the tent. It wasn't surprising that she had performed so well, he thought. Will Treaty was one of the most accomplished members of the Ranger Corps, and he'd been trained by Halt, a legend among the green and gray cloaked community. Harlan switched his gaze now to the slightly built figure before him. Maddie had tossed back her cowl, and her short hair was tousled. There were even one or two wisps of dead grass caught in it. She stood erect, facing him with a look of determination, even defiance, on her face. She was slightly flushed, he noticed, angry at being caught so close to her objective. He assumed correctly. "Overall, you've done well, Madeline," he said. "Aside from the unseen movement exercise, you've pretty well topped the course." He indicated the report sheets in front of him. His two companions, with copies of their own, grunted their agreement. "Your results are more than good enough for you to advance to fourth-year training," he said, and he saw a slight relaxation of her shoulders as she heard that piece of news. Then, after a second or two, she stiffened once more, and her jaw set in a stubborn line. He gathered the reports together, tapping them on the table to align them, and continued. "You'll take a makeup assessment for unseen movement in 3 months or so," he told her. "I'm sure you'll have no trouble passing it." "It's not fair," Maddie blurted the words out, unable to contain herself any longer. Harlan set the rearranged reports down on the table and raised an eyebrow at the angry face before him. "Not fair? How is it not fair? You were caught 50 meters from your objective." "But it's a test of unseen movement," she protested. "And he never saw me. He trod on my hand." "Are you saying you weren't apprehended?" Harlan asked quietly. Maddie, now committed to her protest, went on. "I'm saying I wasn't seen." She swung around and gestured to her captor. "The very fact that he stood on my hand proves it. He had no idea I was there. It was a test of unseen movement, and he never saw me." "Until you cried out and moved," Harlan said. "Then he saw you." She shook her head in defiance. It wasn't a test of being trodden on, she said, aware that the words sounded ridiculous, but unable to think of another way to frame them. "It was a test of your ability to remain concealed," Harlan pointed out. "Have you considered what might have happened if you hadn't reacted? If you hadn't cried out?" "Well, of course I cried out," Maddie blustered. "This great oaf stood on my hand. You'd have cried out too." The great oaf in question, who was, like most rangers, slim in build and below average height, couldn't help smiling at her description of him. He liked Maddie. He had watched her going through her assessments and admired her. He knew that she had to perform at a higher level than the other apprentices because she was a girl, the first to be accepted for ranger training. There were too many people who were ready to dismiss her because of that fact. She couldn't just do as well as the boys in her year. She had to do better. "Merton," said the assessor on the right, "what would have happened had Madeline remained silent?" Maddie's captor shrugged. "In all likelihood, I would have continued on. Initially, I thought I'd trodden on a tree root or a fallen branch." He smiled. "But then the branch called out, 'Ow!' and I knew I was mistaken." Maddie's scowl deepened. Harlan looked from Merton to her once more. "Did you think of not reacting?" he asked her. She flushed angrily. "I didn't think. He trod on my hand with his great clumsy boot." She paused, then added defiantly, "Because he hadn't seen me." Said Harlan thoughtfully. Gudrus, the ranger seated to his right, leaned forward. "Tell me, Maddie," he said, "what made you choose that field to try to break through the line? After all, the grass in the adjacent fields was much longer." She paused, swallowing her anger for a moment, then answered. "I figured they'd assume that I'd go through the longer grass," she explained, "so the searchers in the low grass wouldn't be as attentive as they might be. Plus, they tend to spread out farther." The three assessors exchanged a glance. Will and Gillen, at the back of the tent, did likewise. Gillen pursed his lips in an appreciative expression. "That's good thinking," said Downey, the third assessor. The others grunted. Maddie's marks for tactical planning bore out the choice. "Except," Harlan said, deciding that too much praise was not a good thing for this young woman. She was caught. "Only because he stood on me," Maddie flared. Behind her, Will raised an eyebrow at Gillen, as if to say, "See what I mean?" Gillen shrugged. "We've established that that was unfortunate," Harlan said, a trifle briskly, "but it doesn't alter the result." Maddie heard the change of tone from even-handed and slightly sympathetic to decisive and final. She realized any further argument could well be counterproductive for her. She had opened her mouth to protest further. Now she shut it firmly. Harlan noticed her capitulation and nodded approval. Then he continued, in a more conciliatory tone. "In any event, Maddie, your performance at this gathering has been exceptional, and I'd like to congratulate you on passing your third-year assessment." "Hear, hear," murmured Downey and Gudrus. Maddie allowed herself the ghost of a smile, even though her flushed features indicated that she was still annoyed about failing her test by sheer accident. Harlan looked up at the two senior rangers behind the girl and singled out Will. "Congratulations to you too, Will Treaty," he said. "Her performance reflects well on your training and guidance." Will shrugged. "I merely show the way, Harlan," he said. "Maddie follows it. Any success is due to her efforts." "Quite so," said Harlan, smiling inwardly at the other man's humility. He looked back to Maddie and took her bronze oak leaf from the tabletop, where she had placed it when the hearing began. He handed it back to her now. "Here, Maddie. I'm delighted to tell you that you are to advance to your 4th year of training with Ranger Will." Maddie took the oak leaf and dropped the chain over her head, arranging the small bronze symbol at her throat. Had she failed the year's assessment, the oak leaf would have been marked by a small hole hammered through the brass. If she accumulated 3 of those throughout her training period, she would be politely asked to leave the Corps. She was proud that her oak leaf, symbol of her rank as an apprentice ranger, was unmarked. Harlan pushed back his chair now and stood, reaching across the table to shake her hand. Goodrus and Downey did the same. Maddie shook hands and bowed her head as they congratulated her. She turned to go and found herself facing Merton, the young ranger who had caught her. He, too, offered his hand. "Congratulations, Maddie," he said. She hesitated. She was still angry about the way he had found her, but his smile was genuine, and his manner was friendly. She shook hands with him. "Thanks," she said briefly, and she gave him a reluctant smile. It was impossible to stay angry with someone as cheerful as he was. "You should be proud of yourself," he said to her. "1 in 4 apprentices doesn't make it this far, not without having to repeat a year at least once." She was too surprised to say anything. She hadn't realized that the failure rate was so high. Will certainly hadn't told her. He hadn't wanted to worry her about the possibility of failure. Not that it was something Maddie ever considered. She relinquished Merton's hand, mumbled a thank you, and turned away to where Will and Gillen were waiting for her. Her mentor drew the tent flap aside and motioned her through ahead of him. He and Gillen followed, and the 3 of them strode in line, abreast through the gathering ground toward the spot where they had pitched their simple, one-person tents. They walked in silence for several minutes. Then Maddie couldn't restrain herself any longer. "I still say it's not fair," she said quietly. Will glanced sidelong at her. "And I imagine you will keep saying so until you do your makeup assessment in 3 months," he said. There was a note of finality in his tone that warned her not to continue with the matter. Gillen, however, had something to add. "Maddie, if you really think you've been badly treated, I am obliged to look into the matter. I am the commandant, after all. Are you making an official complaint here?" Maddie was aghast at the thought that she might be seen to be invoking the authority of the corps commandant. "Goodness, no, Gillen," she said quickly. "I don't think of you as the commandant." "Well, thank you very much," Gillen said. "I'm glad my authority is so negligible." She hastened to qualify her statement. "I mean, I know you're the commandant, of course, and I respect you for it, but I think of you more as a friend." "Well then," he replied, "as a friend, let me advise you. Accept the judgment and let this matter drop. In fact, keep it in mind for the future. You may well be the most accomplished person at unseen movement." "Am I?" said Maddie, brightening, but he simply looked at her for several seconds before replying. "I'm saying that as a hypothetical," he said, and she subsided, her balloon of pride well and truly pricked. "But even if you were," he went on, "the fact is that accidents and bad luck happen. A little mistake, a little unexpected event can give you away. Don't forget it." She thought about his words, then nodded. "You're right, Gillen. I'm sorry." She turned to Will. "And I won't go on and on about this when we're home," she said. Will snorted. "That'll be the day." Before she could reply, Gillen drew their attention to a figure seated comfortably by the fire in front of their 3 tents. "And unless my eyes deceive me, that would seem to be Halt waiting for us," he said. "Wonder what he wants," Will mused. "I'm sure he'll tell us," Maddie said in a self-satisfied voice. It was the kind of answer Will would give to her if she ever voiced a rhetorical question like that, and she was pleased to have an opportunity to say it to him. "I think I preferred it when you were whining about being trodden on," Will said. All right, that's going to be the end of Chapter 2. Thank you all for joining me. I'll see you guys next time in Chapter 3. God bless, and have a good one.